Hi, I'm Brian Goulet of the Goulet Pen Company and Ink Nouveau, and this is the 5th episode of Goulet Q&A here on September 20th. And this topic is all about inks. But before I get into inks, I want to apologize for my last episode where I mistakenly said that I was nearing middle age. I didn't actually look up what people consider middle age to be, and I didn't realize that it was somewhere between 45 and 65. I'm 29 years old, and I thought that, maybe 35 was considered middle age, and that just goes to show you how young and naive I really am. So I apologize to everybody. I'm definitely not middle age. I'm still young. Maybe my 2 kids make me feel old sometimes. But anyway, I did want to apologize. However, that in combination with all the attention I got from the collared shirts I've been wearing lately, I thought it was appropriate to wear a t-shirt, and I thought it would be kind of funny and ironic to choose this one. So, hope you enjoyed that. Nice little ironic twist for everybody there. So that said, I've got a lot of good topics today on ink. I'm actually going to break this up into 2 parts because I had so many questions. I had like upwards of 50 pretty good questions. I'm still not going to be able to get to everybody, but I'm going to break it up into 2 parts. I'm picking kind of the ones that I think are the most beneficial and the ones that I can answer the best. The first video that I'm going to focus on here, these are going to be kind of broader, more general ink questions that maybe you'll be able to get just a good sense of inks as a whole. And then the second video I'm going to do are a little more specific inks about particular products or pens and things like that. So that said, let's get to it. So I had GimmeCookiee on Ink Nouveau ask, are there any inks that are suitable for writing on glossy paper, like those commonly used for greeting cards? The paper doesn't seem to absorb water-based inks, and I would have to resort to gel-inked ball points on them. Yes, that's an excellent question. I get asked that a lot. If you're dealing with really glossy paper, like photo paper, you're not going to get fountain pen inks to work on those because those are coated so heavily, made to resist any kind of water, moisture, anything like that. And fountain pen ink literally is water. So you are trying to physically do something that will not happen. You will need to use something solvent-based to work on a greeting card or like a photo marker specific kind of thing. I think what you're asking here, GimmeCookiee, is about not super like shiny glossy, but just ones that are more heavily coated. It's going to depend from one card to another. If you're talking about like the photo type gloss, forget it. You're not going to do that. You need a Sharpie or something like it. If you're talking about just something that's really heavily coated and the ink kind of pools up and just doesn't look quite right, it'll stick to it, but it'll smear really bad and won't really dry. The best thing that I've found on that is to use pigmented ink, which you can get. Platinum's got a few of those, like Platinum Carbon Black, Pigmented Blue, or Sailor has a couple of their nano inks. Those will also work okay. And the reason they work better is because they dry on the surface of the paper instead of soaking in like most all other fountain pen inks. Aside from those though, pretty much everything else is going to give you some trouble. So hopefully that helps you out before the holidays come around here. FMF is dead on Twitter. Why is water resistance not considered an important property for more ink companies besides noodlers? That is an excellent question, and the honest answer is I have no friggin' clue. I don't know why more people don't focus on water resistance. What's funny is that other people will ask, why does noodlers care so much about water resistance? Or why do people in general care about water resistance? It really comes down to preference, to culture, maybe. I think that here in the US, we tend to be more obsessed with saturated ink colors and permanence and things like that. That is not as much of a priority in other parts of the world, which is, Japan, Germany, other parts of Europe. That's where most of this pen stuff is coming from, and I guess it's just not as much of a priority there. I really can't give you a firm answer as to why you don't see that, but I know that Nathan Tardif of Noodlers is specifically driven on permanence, forgery resistance, waterproofness, things like that. So that's why you see so many from Noodlers. And in fact, all of the inks that I can think of that have come out in the last several years have either had some combination of waterproofness or UV reactivity or something just kind of crazy out there. So I think a lot of it is just it's been underserved in the market and Noodlers is focused on it. But I would say in general, probably it's because most inks that come from pen companies tend to be pretty watered down, pretty safe, not extreme properties really at all, because, you know, they always warranty their pens with their specific inks, so they tend to want to tone it down a little bit. They don't oversaturate them, they don't put any extreme properties in there. It's companies, you know, more boutique ink companies like Noodler's that are probably more likely to be out there on a ledge. So anyway, hopefully that helps you. Jen Wyvern 2 on YouTube and also Stephen B on Facebook had kind of the similar question. I thought it would be useful if you discussed iron gall inks a bit next week. Some people love them, that's me. Others won't let them anywhere near their pens, so it would be interesting to hear your take. Okay. I'm happy to talk about this. I get asked about iron gall inks from time to time. I don't have a vast amount of experience with them. There aren't a lot of fountain pen inks that are iron gall. Diamond Registrar's Blue Black is one that I can think of. Mont Blanc Blue Black is another one, or I think it's Mont Blanc Midnight Blue is the name of it. I don't carry that one, but that is one that I know is iron gall. Lamy Blue Black, I believe, used to be, and it has not been for the last year or so. Or maybe a year and a half. So that one's not a concern anymore. Rohrer & Klingner Salix and Rohrer & Klingner Scabiosa. Those are all the ones off the top of my head that I can think that are iron gall. There are other iron gall inks in there, and true iron gall is actually really, really thick and needs to be used with a dip pen. All the iron galls that are made for fountain pens are some kind of modern watered down formulation of true iron gall. So if you look up iron gall, actually the Wikipedia page for iron gall is really good and really comprehensive. That's usually the source that I end up pointing most people to. But basically, iron gall uses oak galls to get permanence on paper. It's a natural form of waterproof ink, and it works well. The only problem is it tends to corrode metal. So you need to be really careful when using it in your pens. Flush it regularly. Don't leave it sitting in your pen for long periods of time. If you use it in one pen continuously for a long time, it's going to eat away, especially gold. So you have to be careful about it. Now, I believe that the modern fountain pen ink formulations are not as much of a concern as they used to be way back in the day. The Diamond Registrar's, I've heard, is kind of one of the more, you know, pure fountain pen iron gall formulas, I guess, if you want to call it that. But I don't have any of the chemical information on these inks because they don't publish it anywhere. So that's just kind of my opinion, my speculation. So hopefully that helps you a little bit with iron gall. Definitely check out that Wikipedia page though. But in general, if you don't know anything about iron gall and it seems like a lot of fuss, just don't bother. You know, you can get waterproof inks that aren't iron gall these days and just not even have to worry about it. So Stephen B on Facebook and also Dave G on Facebook had a similar question. Can highlighter ink be used in a fountain pen, or is it only for use in a special highlighter pen? It can be used in a fountain pen. It's going to seem kind of weak, kind of light, because they tend to be a little brighter inks, not necessarily made for writing words, but more, you know, put down in kind of a swath so that you can cover over entire words and have just kind of that highlighting effect. So if you're using any like Noodler's Dragon Cats or Year of the Golden Pig or Private Reserve Chartreuse or the Pelikan Duo highlighter inks, you know, you'll wanna probably use those in a highlighter pen. You know, basically you can buy replaceable tip highlighter marker type pens. The Platinum Preppy has a highlighter marker pen that works pretty well with those inks. In a fountain pen, they tend to get a little cloggy sometimes. They tend to not show up real well. I know some people that like them, like maybe the darker colors and stuff, but generally speaking, you can probably find a non-highlighting fountain pen ink that will be a little more appealing in your fountain pen for that purpose. So it's not that you can't use it, it's just that maybe it's not the ideal purpose. It'll perform better in a highlighter pen. Oh gosh, your name. etakemllac, sorry, on YouTube. I would love to hear about inks that are not necessarily workplace friendly. There's a lot of talk about inks that are, but not everyone needs that. Let's hear about bright colors and especially anything that shades exceptionally well. It seems that these inks are often overlooked for blue blacks and such. Yeah, I would agree. I think a lot of it depends on what your workplace is. I can tell you around here, the brighter and crazier your ink is, the cooler you are. That said, not all workplaces are like that. I think blacks and blue blacks tend to be what everybody uses at work just to kind of be safe. Maybe a dark brown, dark green, dark purple if you're really getting crazy. But if you're looking for just complete opposite end of the spectrum, you should definitely check out some of the darker oranges, maybe some of the darker reds. Red can kind of be one of those that it gets really interesting because some people like really associate red with, you know, when your teacher marks up your paper and you get lots of bad things in your essays and stuff like that, and they might mark it in red. So red can be a fun one to kind of mess with people's heads. Noodler's Apache Sunset is one of my favorites because it's got this yellow, orange, red kind of color combination. It shades so intensely and it's got cool colors. If you want to get a little darker, Noodler's Antietam or Cayenne is good. Diamond Ancient Copper, that one's a lot of fun. It's kind of a brown, red, orange. Let's see here, what else? If you want kind of a dark blue, but something fun, I like Diamond Majestic Blue. It's got a red sheen to it. So that's kind of dark and at first glance might not look too crazy, but if you hold it in the light correctly, you catch that red sheen, it kind of pops. If you really want to get wild and out there, Diamine, let's see here, what's it called? Apple Glory. It's like a bright green, really kind of crazy. Diamond Meadow is nice too, Kelly Green. Let's see here, what else is there? Some, you know, there's lots of turquoise colors. Those can be a lot of fun. Noodler's Navajo Turquoise, Diamond Marine is one of my favorites. Those are some good ones. If you like, sorry, I mentioned reds and I didn't name any of the inks. Diamond Red Dragon's one of my favorites. Noodler's Nikita or Widowmaker is always fun. Tiananmen is fun, that's a dark red. Schaefer Red is kind of like a bright classic red. Those can all be fun. So hopefully that gives you an idea of some. Definitely just look for what's kind of bright and crazy and go nuts. Let's see here. Penny Simon on YouTube. You said, I've read reviews that refer to some inks, such as Noodler's Kung Na Cheng, as difficult. What qualities are they referring to when they say this? And can this tendency be compensated for with the right choice of pen? And then you had another question, which I'll get to in a second. So I had a couple of people ask me about Kung Na Cheng. That ink is really just kind of a special one that's in its own category. Nathan Tardif created that ink especially. He formulated it from an ink that was used back in China long time ago. And I should have brushed up on it before I spoke on it here. I'm not going to spout off all the history because I don't want to say anything wrong. But it's a very special ink that was formulated for a very specific purpose, even to smell exactly like the ink used to. He did a lot of historical research, worked with Kung Na Cheng on doing that, and that's why the ink is named that. So it's kind of a special ink. It does have some quirky properties to it. It tends to dry up in the pen a little bit, so you need a pen that's going to stay pretty lubricated, stay pretty wet and seal up really nicely. Even still, you might have some starting issues. You just kind of live with that. Maybe pick a wetter writing pen. And then, can it be compensated with the right choice of pen? Yeah, it definitely can. A wetter writing pen will help. One trick that I know that I've tried before is to take a very small piece of sponge, cut it up, wet it, and stick it in the cap. And then that kind of helps to keep the nib moist. That's a trick that you can use on a lot of different pen inks if you have a pen that stays particularly dry, if you've got room in the cap of that pen. What you don't want to do is have the nib touching that sponge and then it'll wick all the ink out of your pen. That's not good, but you can experiment with that a little bit. It's just kind of a little hack that I figured out, or that I've heard other people do too. I didn't figure it out myself, but I read it up and tried it myself. That trick can work. Let's see here, you said also, when does a person require the use of a lubricated ink? So lubricated inks, you're talking like the Noodler's Eel series, Monteverde advertises lubricated, the Pilot Iroshizuku inks aren't advertised as lubricated, but everybody kind of associates them as lubricated. The point of lubricated inks, I think pretty much all inks have lubrication in them to some degree. The reason is because ink is mostly water, but the reason that it gets its color is because of the dyes that are in there. Dyes are very dry, so dyes are hard to flow through the pen. So to compensate for that, ink makers use lubricants to help to move everything along. So the heavier the dye saturation, the more lubricant they add in there to compensate for the dye. That's why you end up with things like nib creep, where the ink kind of comes up through the nib and the nib slit and gets onto the nib surface, is because there's so much lubricant in there, it just wants to come out of the pen. So that's why you end up with that sometimes. But the point of kind of over lubricated inks is to kind of lubricate the inside of the pen. If you've got a piston pen or even your converter, it'll kind of lubricate the walls of your converter or your pen and allow the piston to slide up and down, and you don't need to, I guess, maintain it quite as often as to grease it up and that kind of thing to keep it operating smoothly. That's kind of the point of the lubricated inks. As a consequence, they tend to flow smoother, write wetter, things like that. So it can be used to compensate for a really dry writing pen as well. Let's see here. Inato18 on YouTube, he said, for the ink Q&A, I'd like to hear about scented inks. Customer reviews seem to suggest that most scented inks are bland, generic, flowery smells. But I'd like to find some more interesting ones like those Sanford Mr. sketch markers I had as a kid. That would be cool, wouldn't it? I don't know all that much about essential oils and scents and things like that. But I imagine that whatever they're putting in those Mr. Sketch markers probably would not be too good for your fountain pen using it ongoing. So with most scented inks, the novelty is pretty much in with the person that's using it. You might think that like, oh, if I use a scented ink, then when I write the letter, they'll open it up and they'll be overwhelmed with this smell of this flowery whatever, or whatever chocolate, if there's a chocolate scented ink or something like that. It doesn't quite work like that. The scents usually wear off pretty quickly, like an hour after it gets out. So you really kind of shouldn't expect that the recipient of your letter is going to be able to smell anything. Then you're going to spray some perfume or something like that. And when I was in college, I was really poor, so Rachel and I were long distance. I smeared some Degree deodorant on one of the greeting cards I mailed her one time because that was a smell that she associated with me. Kind of a funny little story there. So yeah, there's really not, I don't know chemically why it can't be done, but I know that I've never heard of any scented ink that's been particularly strong, especially not as strong as those scented markers. I imagine there's quite a bit of chemistry difference that goes on between the way those markers are made and the way fountain pen ink is made. So that said, pretty much scented inks, you're gonna get kind of a bland smell of something kind of flowery. That's about all you're going to get. Diatramentis actually has the biggest selection of scented inks. That's kind of the thing. They've got all the different kinds. They've got ones that smell like wood, and whiskey and wine, and all these other kind of crazy smells. But again, they're not overwhelming. They're not real sharp. They're subtle, and they do wear off, relatively quickly. So, mikehewHI on YouTube said, are some inks more prone to clogging fountain pens than others? Is there a preference on the different kinds of inks, such as bulletproof, eternal, lubricated, etc., to eliminate this? All right, so when you're talking about clogging, I don't know necessarily how everybody defines clogging. When I think clogging, I think that the ink is actually gumming up inside the pen and not flowing through. A couple of things that can cause that, maybe not related to the ink at all. If you haven't cleaned out your pen in a really long time, clean it out and try it again. Clogging issues a lot of times are caused by poor pen maintenance. So you're going to want to try to clean your pen every couple of weeks. And if you have a pen that dries out particularly fast, you're going to want to, adjust that accordingly, maybe clean it even more often. This is even if you're using the same color. You're going to want to clean the pen every couple of weeks. And the reason for that is as you're writing with your pen, your nib is creating a static charge on the paper. And if you could actually see kind of on a macro level that as you're writing, that static charge is literally like drawing dust fibers out of the air and attracting it to your nib. And it's taking paper fibers and almost kind of grabbing them into your nib. Now, it's not anything that's happening like instantaneously. It happens over time. But if you're writing with it regularly for a couple of weeks, you're going to get some junk up in your pen from writing. Combine that with maybe leave the ink sitting in there for a while. Some of the water tends to evaporate out. You have more dye concentration left in your pen than you normally did when you first inked it. And that combination of things can clog your pen. So pen maintenance is key. That said, there are some inks that do tend to have, a rougher time flowing through than others. Some of that's just the nature of the ink, and it's not, the Noodler's Eternal inks, I think in general tend to be a little higher maintenance. You need to clean those out pretty regularly. Bulletproof inks, not necessarily. Noodler's Eternal series of inks, like the, you know, all the like the 1 ounce bottles they have, and some of the Russian and UK inks they have are the Eternal ones. That's what I'm thinking of. Those ones tend to be a little higher maintenance. But you know, their bulletproof inks, like Bulletproof Black is pretty good. That one's pretty low maintenance. They have a lot of other inks that are classified as bulletproof. Some of them are a little higher maintenance, some of them are not. But in general, if you're going for like complete ease of use, okay, just stay away from all permanent inks and you're gonna have, you know, fewer problems. Lubricated inks generally are not a problem because again, they're lubricated, so they're gonna help to flow through the pen. But yeah, okay, so aside from pen maintenance, another thing, actually this kind of goes in line with pen maintenance, but if you are switching ink colors and not cleaning out the pens all the way, some of the clogging issues can actually be from one ink mixing in the pen with an older ink that you have that was left in there. Not all inks are compatible with each other, and sometimes they can actually react and congeal a little bit, or at least slow things down. It's not super often that happens, but it certainly could be a factor. Or if you have an old dried up ink that's in the pen, you don't clean it out all the way, you can put another ink in there, and as you're using it, a little piece of old dried up ink can kind of break through and kind of clog the feed as it's going through. So really pen maintenance will eliminate a lot of that. But if you have an opinion about certain specific inks, I'd love to hear what you have to say. Just leave me a comment. Okay, let's see. Tanyees on YouTube, you said, how does diluting ink affect its properties? For example, viscosity, flow, dry time, etc. Feathering, etc. Is the reverse true if left in a pen for some period? Okay, you got a couple other questions for me here, but I'll stick to those for right now. So how does diluting ink affect its properties? Okay, well, most inks, especially the heavier saturated ones like Private Reserve and Noodlers, you can dilute them probably about 10% and not even be able to tell a difference. When you're doing that, it's best to use distilled water. Distilled water has had all of its minerals and everything removed. It's basically just water. If you have ink, water that is pure and that you know is pure, you can use tap water if you really want to, especially if it's not that big of a deal to you. Distilled water is generally best. That's what I officially recommend to everybody because you kind of know what you're getting with distilled water. So if you are diluting it about 10%, it's going to flow possibly a little smoother, okay? Because if you have a lot of dye in your ink, you're adding water, it can flow smoother. That said, that's not necessarily true for all inks, because if you have an ink that's heavily lubricated, then you adding more water is actually diluting the lubricant as well. So unfortunately, I can't say diluting ink will always give you such and such a result. I think in general, I tend to hear certain inks will dilute better than others. That said, I know that Noodlers in particular very, very heavily saturates their inks, and the reason why is because, you know, Nathan Tardif firmly believes in, you know, cost, utility, and effectiveness and things like that. So he actually kind of oversaturates it so that if you want to dilute it, if you dilute about 10%, some of the inks even up to 25%, you won't have a drastic noticeable difference in the color, but it'll just allow your ink to go that much further. You get more dime for your buck or whatever. That saying doesn't make any sense. You get more bang for your buck, whatever it is. So if you are diluting your ink, it's something you're going to have to just kind of experiment with. I think in general, diluting very heavily saturated inks will probably get you the best result. I don't know if that answers your question completely. I haven't experimented with diluting a ton of inks. Oh, you asked, is the reverse true if left in a pen for some period? Most pens will dry out after some period of time, a couple of days, maybe in the extreme, a couple of weeks is the kind of the norm. So if you are either leaving your bottle of ink open or leaving your pen out and the water is evaporating out of it, you're going to have a higher dye concentration left in it, and therefore it will not flow as well. So if you wanted to reconstitute the dye in the ink, you could add a little more water back in, proportionate to whatever you feel has evaporated out of there, and you can kind of get it going again. Which inks are good for flexing? Like SBRE Brown mentioned, X-Feather. How best to bring out shading in a saturated ink? Would diluting work? Okay, so you're asking specifically about diluting and shading and things like that. I think generally speaking, yeah, if you're diluting it, it's going to shade a little better because you have less of a dye saturation. Therefore, you should get better shading. X-Feather is good for flexing. That tends to be a little bit thicker ink. And I think that most flex pens tend to have a pretty generous flow. So X Feather will kind of rein the flow back in a little bit. Some other ones that are good for flexing, I know Black Swan Australian Roses and Black Swan in English Roses were both kind of formulated for flex pens. I've used Noodler's Black, Heart of Darkness to a good degree. Yeah, it's really just a Noodler's Apache Sunset. Those are some of my favorites. I know these are all Noodler's inks, but those are the ones that I've experimented with most in my flex pens. Pascal D on Facebook, what's the best way to safely store bottled ink? I've bought J-Arbon cartridges that were half empty and still sealed when I started. Is there an expiration date on bottled ink? Okay, you're kind of asking me two different questions there. Cartridges are very different from bottled ink. Bottled ink is stored in glass most often. Cartridges are stored in plastic. Okay, so if you have plastic, eventually, depending on the type of plastic, you can have evaporation happen because it's going to leach actually through the plastic. I've witnessed exactly what you're talking about with those J-Arbon ink cartridges, and if you notice on gouletpens.com, I don't carry any ink cartridges because I was seeing the exact same thing. I don't know how quickly that's happening, but if you leave ink cartridges sitting long enough, you will have moisture evaporate out of those cartridges leaching through the plastic. So I'm not a big fan of cartridges necessarily, and that's one of the reasons why. So that said, if you do pop that cartridge and add a little bit of water back in there, shake it up, you should be able to kind of reconstitute that and get that, kind of reclaim that ink in those cartridges. So that was one part of your question. The other one was, what's the best way to store bottled ink? And does it have an expiration date? So technically, no, they don't have expiration dates. There's nothing printed on them, any of the brands that I carry, that say when this ink will go bad. It's not like milk or anything like that. So that said, a lot of it's going to depend on how the ink is stored. You're going to want to keep it out of direct sunlight. So even if that's just keeping it in the box that it came in, assuming it's not a clear box like the Schaefer box, which is clear, and that doesn't help you at all with UV. Most fountain pen inks will come in a box of some kind. So keeping it in the box or putting it in a drawer, a cabinet, or something like that, just keeping it out of direct sunlight, that is kind of the #1 key because UV will just kill the dyes in your inks. Okay. Another big thing is making sure the cap is sealed all the way. If it's not sealed tightly, then water is going to evaporate out of that ink. Now you can always reconstitute it by putting some distilled water back in there. But if you do that enough times, I'm sure it's going to affect the quality of some kind. Another thing is how you're maintaining your pens when you go to ink them. If you are not thoroughly cleaning your pens in between changing ink colors, you're probably going to have some problems over time with that bottle of ink. If you're also using your pen and using the same bottle of ink but never cleaning out your pen, just think about kind of what I mentioned just a minute ago about how as you're writing, you're creating a static charge on your nib. Dust and paper fibers and stuff are drawn to the nib. They can get all gunk up in the feed. Well, if you are never cleaning your pen out and you're just building up more and more and more junk inside your pen, every time you are flushing and filling in that bottle of ink of the same color, eventually you're going to end up with that gunk inside your ink. And by the time you get to the bottom of that bottle of ink, you're going to have some serious junk in there. So it's always good, even if you're using the same color every couple of weeks, to just flush it out. It doesn't have to be super thorough, but just some clean water, just flush it out. And then when you've got your water, try and get as much water out of the pen as possible. That's another thing. If you're cleaning the pen and you've got a ton of water left in it, and then you go to fill it and you're dumping more and more water into your bottle of ink as you go, it can dilute it, and you'll probably actually will never know, because unless you got a pretty serious amount of water, even if you dilute it 5%, 10%, you likely would never really be able to tell. But it's just something to kind of keep into consideration. So hopefully that answers your question. Oh, but okay, ultimately, I'm sure you're asking what's the expiration date. Some people just use a general rule of a year. I don't think that's very long at all. Honestly, I think 5 to 10 years for anybody using these inks on a semi-regular basis would be pretty reasonable. That's going to depend on how it's stored, how it's used, and all that kind of stuff. I know people that use vintage inks that are 50 years old. Then you are going to get into some more issues because you have no idea how those were stored. But that said, it's not a total deal breaker that could happen. John N. on Facebook said, with ink prices ranging from $30 to $9 on your site, what is the difference between the inks? I understand the bulletproofness may be a factor, but are things like viscosity and other factors a factor in the range in pricing? Or is it just the manufacturer's price they can get for it? that's a really good question, because some people think ink is ink. Why are there such a variety of price? Well, there's a lot of things at play here. There's a lot of different factors. Where the ink comes from is certainly a factor, and where it's being sold. You know, if you've got an American ink made in America, or a German ink made in Germany, Japanese ink in Japan, obviously wherever the ink is made, if it doesn't have to travel very far and cross country lines and pay customs fees and shipping and stuff like that, you know, across borders, it's going to be less expensive in whatever the host country is. So that's definitely a factor. You know, here in the US, we've got basically 2 ink companies in America, Private Reserve and Noodler's. Everything else is coming from somewhere else. So that's not a steadfast rule, but I'm talking of the major brands. There's a couple of smaller ones, but of the major ones, and especially pen manufacturer, you know, inks, they're coming from who knows where. So you're going to have currency exchange rates and all these other things that are going to affect what the prices of these inks can be, at least influencing the factor. Some other things you've got is the volume of ink that's in there, the shape of the bottle, how heavy it is. Shipping, you'd be amazed at how big of a difference in the price of shipping there is with some bottles versus others. I'm thinking about like Caran d'Ache's old bottles. Those things were only 30 mils, but they were like solid glass on the bottom, so they were incredibly heavy. That no doubt had to do a huge degree with the price of those inks. Now those are discontinued at this point, and I know I did have a question about that. Actually, why don't I just go ahead and address that? You know, Stefan B on Facebook said, what happened to Caran d'Ache? They just discontinued the ink. I have no idea why. It was a complete shock to me. They're coming out, or I believe they came out with a new ink. I haven't tried it yet or gotten it myself. That's pretty expensive, you know, in a fancy bottle and stuff like that. In fact, that actually kind of ties into what makes it so expensive. You know, that's coming from, you know, Switzerland. So that undoubtedly, you know, Switzerland's exchange rates are much higher than here in the US, so that's definitely a factor in the price. But anyway, so that could be a factor. The volume of ink that's in there, you know, the more ink you have, the more expensive the bottle is going to be, as you could assume. The fanciness of the bottle, like Pilot or Roshizuku, you can bet that bottle is going to cost more than a Noodler's bottle or a Private Reserve bottle. Just the bottle itself is going to cost more. You would probably be amazed at how many bottles you have to buy when getting something done custom like that. It's pretty incredible. So if you want to get a lot of bottles and make them inexpensive, which ink makers kind of need to do to be able to afford to do what they do, you either have to kind of go with something generic, or you got to buy a ton of bottles. Other factors that could be at play could just be marketing. The brand name definitely would play a factor. So there's a lot of different things that go into play. It's not necessarily, I mean, and then you got ink components too. You know, for example, Noodler's is kind of a good example because they've got a huge variety of inks. And Nathan Tardif is very frugal. He's very, very price conscious. And I know that he would make everything as low as he possibly can, but he even has his inks priced differently depending on how expensive the components are and the difficulty in manufacturing them. I believe he mentioned one time that Dragon's Napalm takes something like 6 months to make a batch. Now I could be wrong about the exact time there, but you get the idea. Certain inks can take a very long time to react and do exactly what they need to do to be in their final form. So that would also play a part. Those are kind of all the questions I'm going to address for this one. I am going to do a second part with more questions. I got so many good ones, honestly, that I could probably just go all day. But that should give you at least a decent understanding of at least what I know about inks. I don't know everything. I don't claim to know everything. And please don't come at me saying that you think that I know everything or that I think I know everything, because I don't. I'm just telling you what I think after my 3.5 to 4 years of experience in the fountain pen world, being completely obsessed and poring over this with all my experience. So that said, if you got any comments or any further questions, you can be sure to hit me up on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube, on this video, or on my blog, Ink Nouveau. You can also email orders@gouletpens.com if you have any questions. So I'm not particularly soliciting a lot more questions for the ink part 2. I'm probably going to come out with that again pretty soon here. But if you have any questions, you know, feel free to ask. I've already got some laid out, but if you got a really good question, I feel that it fits in, you know, go ahead, go for it. Otherwise, just kind of let me know what you think about, you know, how the format's going, or just, you know, follow up to anything that I talked about here. I'd love to hear what you have to think. So That said, I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week. This has been another episode of Goulet Q&A. I'm going to do episode 6, I guess, which will be part 2 of the inks. I don't know exactly when I'm going to come out with that, but it's probably going to be here in the next couple days. So hope you enjoyed this one, and as always, right on.